The tablecloth my wife embroidered the year we got married was still on the table. I'd pressed it myself that morning, running the iron slowly over the yellow roses she'd stitched in the corners, thinking about how her hands had moved across that fabric 39 years ago. I'd set out the good plates, the ones we only used at Thanksgiving, and I'd been up since 5 in the morning making the stuffing the way she used to make it, with cornbread and sage and a little too much butter. I was 62 years old, and I was cooking Thanksgiving dinner for my children. That was the first mistake. My oldest son arrived with his wife 40 minutes late, carrying a store-bought pie and an attitude that suggested he'd done me a favor by showing up at all. My younger son came in 15 minutes after that, already on his phone, barely looking up when I opened the door. My daughter drove in from across town with her husband and my 2 grandchildren, 10 and 13, and she kissed me on the cheek and said the house smelled good, which was the kindest thing anyone said to me that day. I'd been working on that meal since Wednesday. The turkey alone had taken 3 hours. I'd made my wife's green bean casserole from scratch, not from a can, because she never used a can, and I was not about to start now. There was a sweet potato dish and homemade rolls, and 2 kinds of cranberry sauce, because my older son claimed he didn't like the jellied kind, and my daughter claimed she didn't like the whole berry kind, and I'd learned decades ago to just make both and not argue about it. They ate like they were doing me a favor. My older son, halfway through the meal, looked around the dining room with an expression I can only describe as appraisal, not appreciation, appraisal, like he was calculating square footage. "Dad," he said, "have you thought any more about what we talked about in September?" I set my fork down. "You're going to have to remind me." He exchanged a look with my younger son. That look, quick, practiced. The kind of look you develop between siblings over decades told me everything I needed to know about how long they'd been discussing whatever was about to come out of his mouth. "About downsizing," he said. "This house is a lot for one person. I manage fine." "You're 62, Dad. You had that knee surgery. The lawn alone. I hired the neighbor's kid to do the lawn." My daughter was looking at her plate. Her husband was looking at the wall. My grandchildren had already asked to be excused and were watching something on a tablet in the living room, and I was grateful for that, at least. "We've been looking into some options," my younger son said. He said it carefully, the way you say something you've rehearsed. "There's a place over in Claremont. It's not a nursing home, Dad. Don't make a face. It's independent living. Very nice. They have activities, a pool. I have a pool, a community pool. People your age. You'd have company." I looked at my older son. I looked at my younger son. I looked at my daughter, who was still studying her plate like it contained the answers to questions she hadn't asked. "This house," I said slowly, "has been in this family for 26 years, and it's worth a lot more now than it was then," my older son said. "The market in this area, I know what the market is." "Dad." He leaned forward. He used the patient voice, the one that means I am explaining something to someone who doesn't fully understand. "If you sold this house, you'd have more than enough to cover a really comfortable place. You'd have money left over. You wouldn't have to worry." "I don't worry now." "You should," my younger son said it quietly. Not cruelly, exactly. But the way you say something true, that you wish wasn't true, you're living off Social Security and whatever Dad's pension pays out. That's not, I get by. Getting by isn't the same as being taken care of. The meal went on. We talked about other things, my grandson's baseball team, my daughter-in-law's promotion, a vacation my younger son was planning to Portugal. I passed the rolls and refilled drinks and kept my face very still, the way I'd learned to keep it still in the 40 years I'd spent in a profession none of my children fully understood or cared to ask about. After dinner, after the dishes, after everyone said goodbye and the house went quiet, I sat in the chair by the window and I thought about what my wife would have said. She'd been gone 6 years, and there were still moments when the absence of her opinion felt like a physical weight in the room. She would have said, "Don't make assumptions, talk to them." I would have said, "I don't think I'm making assumptions." She would have said, "Then wait and see." I waited. It took 11 days. My older son called and said he was coming by to fix a dripping faucet in the guest bathroom. I told him I'd already fixed it. He said he wanted to check it anyway. He'd be there Saturday morning. I said, "Fine, and I meant it, because he used to be the kind of man who fixed things without being asked. And I wanted to believe that man was still in there somewhere, under whatever had calcified over the years. He came Saturday. He looked at the faucet. He confirmed it was fixed. He stood in my kitchen drinking the coffee I made and looked around again with that same appraising expression. And then he said he needed to use the bathroom and disappeared for nearly 20 minutes. I am not a suspicious man by nature. I spent 40 years being deliberate and methodical, and I don't jump to conclusions. But I am also not a foolish man, and 20 minutes is a long time to use a bathroom in a house where every room is visible from the hallway. After he left, I walked through the house. The guest bedroom, the study, my bedroom. I couldn't tell if anything had been disturbed, nothing obvious. But in my study, on the desk where I kept my files orderly, labeled, the way I'd kept files my entire working life, I had the distinct impression that something had been moved and returned. I sat down at my desk and I thought. Then I called the only person whose judgment I'd trusted without reservation for the past 30 years. My attorney. His name is Gerald, and he's been handling my affairs since before my wife was diagnosed with the illness that took her. And he's one of the few people in this world who knows exactly what my affairs consist of. I asked him to pull up my documents and tell me if anyone had made any inquiries, any calls, any requests for information, anything that might suggest someone was researching my estate. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Raymond, your son called this office 6 weeks ago." I kept my voice even. "Which son?" "The older one." "He said he was calling on your behalf. He asked about the process for establishing power of attorney for an aging parent." I sat with that for a long time. "What did you tell him?" "That he'd need to speak with you directly and provide documentation." He didn't call back. Gerald paused. "Raymond, do you want me to—" "Not yet," I said. "Thank you, Gerald." I hung up and sat very still in my study and thought about what I knew and what I didn't know and what I needed to find out. Here's what my children believed about my financial situation. That I was a retired civil engineer who'd worked for the county for 38 years and retired on a modest pension supplemented by Social Security. That I'd paid off the house but had little savings. That I was, as my younger son had put it, getting by. Here is what was actually true. I had, over the course of my career, purchased and paid off 14 rental properties in 3 counties. I had a brokerage account that had been quietly growing since 1987. I had the house, which was worth considerably more than any of my children realized, and I had a private investment in a small manufacturing company that had been paying dividends for 22 years. My wife had known. Gerald knew. My accountant knew. My children did not know because I had never told them. Not out of secrecy for secrecy's sake. I am not a dramatic man, but because I'd watched what money did to families. I'd watched it turn siblings into strangers and children into vultures, and I had made a decision very early in my children's lives that they would not grow up measuring my worth in dollars. They would work, they would earn, they would build their own lives. I would love them and support them and be there when they needed me. And what I had accumulated over a lifetime of work would pass to them when I was gone, and not a moment before. I'd intended it as a gift. I was beginning to understand that they'd seen it as a problem. What happened next was methodical. It had to be, because I am a methodical person, and I needed to understand the full picture before I did anything at all. I called my younger son and told him I'd been thinking about the independent living conversation, and I'd like to hear more. He was immediately, almost suspiciously, enthusiastic. He sent me a brochure that same afternoon. He'd already toured the place, he said. He'd already spoken to the admissions coordinator. He'd already gotten a quote. The quote was $4,200 a month. I called the facility. I asked about their pricing. The woman on the phone confirmed that their rates started at $3,800 and went up depending on care level. She said they had an opening in the spring. I asked if anyone had inquired about availability for a Raymond Whitfield. She checked. She said yes, someone had called in October. My younger son had made that call 3 weeks before Thanksgiving dinner. 3 weeks before the conversation at my table that my older son had framed as spontaneous concern. I want to be careful here about what I felt in those weeks, because I've thought about it a great deal since. There was anger. I'd be dishonest if I said there wasn't. But the anger wasn't hot. It wasn't the kind that makes you say things you regret. It was cold and quiet, and it clarified everything. It burned away all the noise and left only the thing I needed to see. My children had been planning this before they sat at my table. Before the turkey and the rolls and the 2 kinds of cranberry sauce. Before my daughter kissed my cheek and said the house smelled good. They'd already decided what they wanted to do with me, and they'd sat across from me at my wife's embroidered tablecloth and performed a conversation they'd already had. I thought about my wife. I thought about what she would say now. I think she would have said, "You need to know everything before you do anything." I kept going. My daughter, I discovered, had not been part of the initial plan. I don't say this to excuse her silence at that table. Silence has its own weight, but I came to understand, through conversations I had in the weeks that followed, that she had been told rather than consulted. Her husband, who had never quite forgiven me for a comment I'd made at their wedding about financial responsibility, had pushed her in a direction she hadn't fully chosen. My older son had a meeting with a real estate agent in November. I know this because the agent, a young man who had sold a rental property of mine 3 years ago and maintained my contact information, reached out to ask if I was aware that my son had inquired about listing my home. I was not. My older son had represented himself, the agent told me carefully, as acting on my behalf. I thanked the agent. I asked him to do nothing and say nothing. He agreed. I drove past the independent living facility one afternoon. I sat in the parking lot and looked at it for a while. It was a clean building, well maintained. The grounds were nice. I watched an elderly woman being helped into a wheelchair by a young aide, and I thought, there will come a day when I need that. I am not a man who pretends otherwise. I will need help eventually, and I am not too proud to accept it. But I will choose that day. I will choose that place. I will not be arranged. I went home and I called Gerald. "I need to make some changes," I said. Gerald is a patient man. He listened for 45 minutes while I told him everything. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What do you want to do, Raymond?" I told him exactly what I wanted to do. He said he'd have the paperwork ready by the end of the week. "I want to describe Christmas Eve, because that's when everything happened, and I want you to understand that I didn't plan it the way it unfolded. I'd intended something quieter. A conversation, or a series of conversations. I am not a theatrical person, but my older son had sent me a text that morning saying they'd made some progress on the independent living option and wanted to discuss it after dinner, and something about that phrase "made some progress," as if this were a project he was managing, made the decision for me. I'd invited everyone to my house again. My older son and his wife, my younger son, my daughter and her husband, and my grandchildren. I cooked again. Not because I was trying to recreate Thanksgiving. I'm not a sentimental fool, but because cooking is the way I order my thoughts, and I had a great many thoughts to order. We ate. The grandchildren were louder this time, more comfortable. My older grandson, 13, with his grandmother's eyes and a directness I recognized, helped me carry dishes to the table without being asked. And I noticed that. I noticed everything that night. After dinner, after the grandchildren had gone back to the living room, my older son cleared his throat and looked at my younger son, and it was the same look from Thanksgiving, the rehearsed one. "Dad," he started, "we wanted to talk about—" "I know what you wanted to talk about," I said. He paused. "Okay, good. We just want to make sure you're taken care of." I kept my voice level. "Yes, you've said that. There's a timeline component," my younger son said carefully. "The facility has an opening in April, and to hold it, we'd need to sell the house." "The house, yes." And we thought, "Who did you speak to at Gerald's office?" The silence was complete. My older son's face went very still. My younger son looked at the table. My daughter looked at her husband. "That's my older son started." "Don't," I said. Not loudly. I have never needed to raise my voice to be heard. "Think very carefully before you finish that sentence." He didn't finish it. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and I set a folder on the table. Not dramatically, I just set it there. "I had a conversation with Gerald," I said, "after Thanksgiving. We spent several weeks reviewing my affairs and making some adjustments. I looked at my older son. You called his office in October, he told me. I looked at my younger son. You called Claremont Independent Living in October as well, they told me. I looked at my daughter. I don't believe you initiated this. But you sat at my table at Thanksgiving and said nothing, and that is its own conversation. My daughter's eyes were wet. Her husband had the grace, at least, to look at the floor. I have 14 rental properties, I said. I have had them for varying lengths of time, the oldest I've owned for 27 years. I have a brokerage account. I have a private equity position in a company you've never heard of. I am not wealthy the way people on television are wealthy, but I am comfortable in a way that would surprise you, and I have been comfortable for a long time. No one spoke. Your mother and I made a decision when you were children. We decided you would not grow up knowing exactly what we had, because we'd watched money do things to families that couldn't be undone. We wanted you to work. You did work. I was proud of you for that. I paused. I have been proud of you for a great many things. That is what makes this. I stopped. I picked up the folder and I put it back in my pocket. Difficult. My older son said, Dad, we didn't. You spoke to a real estate agent about listing my home, I said, without asking me, without telling me. You told him you were acting on my behalf. The color went out of his face. That is not a misunderstanding, I said. That is not concern. I want you to understand that I understand the difference. My younger son was looking at me now. Something was shifting in his expression, the defensive glaze coming off. Something more honest underneath. I didn't know if I could trust it yet, but I noticed it. What's in the folder? My older son asked finally. Gerald's revision of my estate documents, I said. The changes I made in December. I looked at him steadily. My assets will no longer pass to my children upon my death. I've established a charitable foundation. My wife would have approved of it. There are scholarship funds for first-generation college students. That was her idea, actually. Something she mentioned years ago that I never acted on. There are other allocations. You're welcome to read the full document, if you'd like. The room was very quiet. This house, I said, will also go into the foundation. I have spoken to an attorney who specializes in charitable real estate transactions, and the process is underway. My older son started to speak. I'm not finished. I said it quietly and he stopped. I want to be clear about something. I am not doing this out of spite. I have thought about this very carefully for 6 weeks, and spite is not what this is. This is a decision about what I want to do with what I have built over 62 years of work. That has always been my right. I was simply not fully aware, until recently, that anyone had forgotten that. My daughter said, Dad, her voice broke on the word, I'm so sorry. I looked at her for a long moment. I know you are. I should have said something. At Thanksgiving. I knew it wasn't right. She stopped, pressed her lips together. I didn't. No, I said. You didn't. Her husband opened his mouth, and I looked at him, and he closed it. My older son had gone very still in the way people go still when they're calculating rather than feeling. I recognized the calculation. I'd watched it happen at Thanksgiving, and I was watching it happen now. Part of me was sad about that deeply, quietly sad, but not surprised. My younger son was not calculating. He was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was 17 and had come to me after doing something wrong and told me about it before I'd found out. That expression, the one underneath all the adult layers. I thought you needed help, he said. I really thought, Dad, I wasn't trying to. He stopped, ran a hand through his hair. I don't know how to say this right. Dry. I was scared, he said. That you were alone and you didn't have enough and something was going to happen and I'd not done enough. He looked up. That's not an excuse. I know what I did. But that's why. I thought about that for a moment. That would have been a reasonable fear, I said, if you'd come to me with it. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. We sat at that table for another hour. There were things said that I won't repeat because they belong to my family and not to anyone else. My older son said things that I found insufficient, and I told him so, and we arrived at no resolution that night, which is the truth of it. Resolution is not a thing that happens in an evening. It is slow and uncertain, and sometimes it doesn't come at all, and I was old enough to know that. My daughter helped me with the dishes before she left. We stood at the sink, and she washed and I dried, and we didn't say much. But she put her hand on my arm at one point and held it there, and that meant something. My older grandson appeared in the kitchen doorway while we were finishing. He'd been in the living room the whole evening. He'd caught the tone of the dinner early and had stayed close to his younger brother, keeping him occupied, which was a thing I noticed and appreciated. He said, "Grandpa, do you want me to take the trash out?" I looked at him, this 13-year-old with his grandmother's eyes, and I said, "Yes, that would be helpful. Thank you." He took out the trash. He came back. He leaned against the counter in the way teenagers lean, all elbows and uncertainty, and then he said, "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said. "Thank you for asking." My dad was upset on the way over. He said it carefully, like he was navigating something. He said something like he said tonight was going to be hard. I didn't know what he meant. "Sometimes," I said, "grown-ups have disagreements." He looked at me with the directness I'd recognized at dinner. It seemed like more than a disagreement. "It was," I said. "But those things take time to sort out." He nodded slowly. "Are you still going to sell the house?" "No." Something relaxed in his face. "Good," he said. "I like this house." "So do I." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Grandpa, can I come visit sometime? Just to visit." I looked at him, 13 years old, standing in my kitchen on Christmas Eve, offering the simplest thing in the world. "Yes," I said, "you can." The holidays passed. January came, and February, and I settled into the winter the way I always settle into winter, slowly, deliberately, with soup on the stove and Gerald's paperwork filed and the rental properties managed by the firm I'd used for 15 years. My younger son called in late January. He asked if he could come over. I said yes. He sat in my living room and he told me that he'd had a long conversation with his wife and he'd done a lot of thinking. And he was sorry not for the fear, he said, because the fear had been real, but for the way he'd acted on it, for going around me instead of to me, for not asking what I actually needed before deciding what I needed. It was a real apology. I've heard enough real apologies in my life to know one from a performance. I told him I appreciated it. I told him these things take time. I told him the door was not closed. He said, "The foundation, the scholarship fund. Mom would have loved that." "I know," I said. We sat for a while without talking, which is the kind of conversation I've always been better at than the other kind. My older son and I have spoken twice since Christmas. Both conversations were short and careful, like people negotiating in a language neither of them fully speaks. I don't know what we are to each other right now. I know what I hope we might be eventually, and I know that hope is not the same as expectation, and I am a man who has always tried to know the difference. My daughter calls every Sunday. She called every Sunday, before all of this too, which is something I've thought about. She called when she didn't know what I had. She brought her children over in the summer to use the pool in the backyard, and she sat on the porch with me in the evenings, and we talked about her mother and about nothing in particular, and she did not calculate anything. I have held on to that. Her husband said something at a family dinner in March, an apology that was more of a justification, which is its own kind of thing, and I thanked him for it and said very little else. That relationship will require more time than I have given it, and possibly more generosity than I currently possess. I am working on the generosity. My grandson comes over on Saturdays when his schedule allows. He does his homework at the kitchen table while I do whatever I'm doing. And sometimes we talk and sometimes we don't, and he has his grandmother's eyes and his own particular kind of wisdom that I think he came into the world with rather than acquired. I am teaching him to cook my wife's stuffing recipe. He is a methodical kid, which I appreciate. He measures everything exactly and asks about the reasoning behind each step, which is the only real way to learn anything. He asked me once, this was in February, he was doing a history assignment at my kitchen table. He asked me why I'd never told his dad and his uncles about the money. I thought about how to answer that. "When your great-grandmother was sick," I said, "and your grandfather, my father, was trying to manage everything, Money became the center of every conversation in the family. It changed how people talked to each other. It changed what they were thinking about when they looked at each other. I paused. I didn't want that for your dad, for any of them. My grandson thought about that. He kept his eyes on his homework while he was thinking, which is a habit I recognized. But it kind of happened anyway, he said. Not accusatory, just honest. It did, I said, which is something I've thought about. He looked up. Do you think you should have told them? I have genuinely asked myself this question. I am still asking it. There are days when I think that transparency would have prevented everything, and days when I think that money would have changed my children in ways I couldn't have undone. I don't know which is true. I'm not sure both aren't true at the same time. I made the decision I thought was right, I said. That doesn't mean it was right. He nodded. He went back to his homework. Grandpa, he said after a few minutes. I'm glad you're still in this house. I looked at the kitchen, the counters I'd remodeled when the kids were young, the window over the sink that faces the backyard, the chair at the end of the table where my wife used to sit. So am I said. There is a thing that happens when you get to a certain age, and a crisis passes not fully, not cleanly, but passes enough that you can see around it. You look at your life and you take stock. Not the financial kind of stock, though I do that too, methodically, the way I've always done everything. The other kind. The kind where you count what you have and what you've lost and what you thought you had that turned out to be something else. I have a house I love. I have a grandson who sits at my kitchen table on Saturdays. I have a daughter who calls every Sunday. I have a younger son who gave me a real apology and has been trying, in the months since, to mean it. I have my wife's tablecloth in the closet, still pressed, still beautiful. I have work still ahead of me with my older son, with my daughter's husband, with the parts of my own story I haven't fully sorted out yet. I have the charitable foundation, which has become something I think about, with a feeling I can only describe as rightness. My wife should have been here to see it. She would have had opinions about everything, and I would have listened to all of them, and we would have argued about a few of them, and it would have been better for her involvement. That is simply the truth of it. I am 62 years old. I have, if I take care of myself the way my doctor tells me to and my knee cooperates, a reasonable number of years ahead of me. I intend to spend them in this house, with this tablecloth, making this stuffing, teaching my grandson to measure things exactly and ask about the reasoning. I think about that Thanksgiving dinner sometimes. The good plates, the 2 kinds of cranberry sauce, my sons sitting across from me making a case they'd already decided on, and my daughter with her eyes on her plate, and me keeping my face still and my voice even and my thoughts very close. I think about what my wife would have said. I think she would have said, "You see what you needed to see. Now decide who you want to be about it." I am still deciding. That is the truth of where I am. But I kept the house, and the tablecloth is still in the closet. And on Saturday mornings, my grandson measures the cornbread exactly and asks me why it matters. And I tell him it matters because the details always matter. And he nods like that makes sense to him, and maybe it does. Maybe that's enough to start with.